Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. It's a great honor to introduce our next speaker. My name is Paulina Raniecka, and I am the Research and Communications Coordinator of the ASI Water Security and Justice Cluster and of the New Wave Network. And with us today, we have another speaker, Dr. Maria Rusca, and we are opening today's lecture on the topic of water scarcity applying the lens of water justice. Our Water Security and Justice webinar series uncovers the concept of water security and water justice through four thematic angles, in particular water conflict, water scarcity, water food nexus, and water mining nexus. And today's lecture is the second one of the water scarcity cluster. The lecture will last 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A. We kindly ask you to post your questions in the chat. Let us now introduce our speaker for the day, Dr. Maria Rusca. Dr. Rusca is a senior lecturer in global development at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. Her work focuses on political ecologies of water and hydroclimatic extremes, critical disaster studies, climate urbanism, and experimental political ecologies. Although her research is firmly rooted at the intersection of development studies and environmental geography, Dr. Rusca is committed to developing research at the nexus between social and natural sciences to further the fields of political ecology and development studies. She's also a filmmaker working on urban water insecurities. Her documentaries include Lilongwe Water Works and Water at the Margins. And without further ado, we would like to open the lecture. Welcome, Dr. Maria Rusca, and let me pass over to you.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Paulina, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here to talk about this topic, which really intersects with different aspects of my research. And thank you, of course, to the New Wave Network for organizing this series of lectures and for inviting me to participate. As Paulina has already mentioned, I will be talking about the intersection between climate justice, water insecurity, and urban droughts. The main point of the lecture of this talk will be to think about how water justice as a framework can contribute to advance conceptualizations of water insecurity that recognize the politics of water insecurity and that recognize that water insecurity is socially constructed. And I hope to do that by discussing three aspects. The first one is very briefly thinking about water insecurity and how it is conceptualized in mainstream water policy, and how this conceptualization is critiqued by political ecology scholarship, but also by critical water studies more broadly. And to do that, I will also provide an example from my research that I did in the past about the production of water insecurity in Lilongwe. And then I will think more directly about the ways in which climate change will impact, or it already impacts, water insecurity. In particular, I will argue that it accelerates in ways that are not positive for vulnerable groups. The wastewater flows in the city and can exacerbate insecurity, both in terms of water availability and in terms of water quality. The third point is in light gray, because I will only introduce some ideas around what knowledge base I think I envision in terms of centering climate and water just futures. And I will just provide some ideas, which I hope we can then discuss in the last part of the lecture when we will have a discussion all together. So just to start, I want to start with a picture that I think many of you have seen, either in this form or in another form, as water researchers, but also many water practitioners and students in hydrology and water governance are exposed to this type of images, which basically highlight water stress and how this is distributed in different regions in the world. And central to these representations of water stress is this idea of growing water reduced water availability as population grows, and therefore there is this idea of thinking around average water availability, so average and volumetric availability, a quantitative analysis thereof, and then thinking about how the population is growing in different regions and the implications for water. So what we see a lot is this water stress rankings, where you have different groups ranked depending on whether they're facing or are gonna face high, medium, or lower water stress. Now, what is central in this definition really is this average idea of water availability, this volumetric and hydrological dimensions of water stress, looking at how much, to say it simply, how much rain and how much water will be available in different regions. And this definition, which I would argue is quite technical and managerial, is also reproduced in many definitions of water insecurity. In fact, when you Google water insecurity, a lot of these images are produced to explain water insecurity, which is then often conflated with this average. And one of the key definitions in terms of water insecurity, key as in most used and mobilized in water policy discourses, also focuses on this same idea of availability of water, and talks basically refers to an acceptable quantity and quality of water for different purposes. Now, from a political ecology perspective, these definitions conceal much of what water insecurity is, and in particular, most importantly, the idea that water insecurity is socially constructed, and therefore it's really rooted, it's relational and rooted in power relations that will determine how hydrological risk, including reduced precipitation and droughts, will be distributed across spaces. Much of this work has been done across the urban and rural divide. So Meta's work has focused more on rural areas, and while Loftus and my own work have focused more on the urban. However, it is about recognizing that there is a distributional and a political element to water insecurity, whether that's an urban space or a rural area. Today, though, we will focus more on the urban. And so if we try to compare these definitions, what we see is that the techno-managerial conceptualizations tend to focus more on physical water availability versus political ecology definitions, which focus more on the relational and socially produced element, political element of water insecurity. So in the first one, there is a focus on hydrological processes, while in political ecology, the focus is on social power and differential agency, as in the ability of different social groups to respond to water insecurity, as we will see later on in the presentation. And so in these definitions that are more technical managerial, the focus is more on average use. So, for example, we have seen water stress in a region or in a country, while in political ecology and other critical water studies, the focus is more on disaggregate users. The big difference is that the first conceals differences and only highlights the average within a country or within a region without showing who is really experiencing that water stress and who and why is insecure in a given country or a city or region. And so I will discuss this more in detail in the next slides, and I will focus, as I said, on cities. And there are a few reasons to focus on cities. The first is that my research is actually quite urban, so that's where I'm better able to develop these arguments. But also cities have already experienced significant water stress. This is a map of cities that have experienced water crisis, water shortages over the past few years. But also cities, both in the global north and in the global south, are characterized by uneven or differential levels of water insecurity, and so are certainly significant scale to examine the implication of climate change, water insecurity, and water justice. And last, because cities are quite unequal places, and this is true both in the global north and the global south, and therefore are a good scale to show how these inequalities in terms of water security are socially produced within cities. And when we talk about inequalities, this also applies to what the IPCC report calls the adaptation gap, so the capacity of different residents, urban residents, to adapt to changing conditions, including water insecurity. And so, as I said, I would like to look at this intersection between water security and consider it as a question of justice. So obviously there are many ways of thinking about water security as a question of justice. And what I want to do today through some examples and some also by introducing some conceptual approaches is to look at the question of water security and justice by looking in particularly as water security insecurity as the outcomes of politics of distribution and politics of infrastructures, water insecurity as exclusion from political participation in decision-making processes, and then also water security as an outcome of the failure to recognize historical and persisting experiences of marginalizations and inequality. So in terms of recognitional justice, but also in terms of thinking about water insecurity as a failure to imagine water just futures. And here I'm thinking in particular about the idea that water justice is not only about identifying multiple intersecting dimensions of inequality that generate water insecurity, nor only about identifying the vested interest in maintaining the status quo, so the power relation underlying these inequalities, but also about creating the political space to imagine alternative futures. And so to generate a politics of possibility on the one hand, but also to foster the imagination of alternative water just futures. So I will start with the first point, looking at water insecurity as politics of distribution of and infrastructures. And I will do that by looking at the city of Lilongwe, which is the capital of Malawi, where I've done much of my research in the past years. And what you see here is a map of the city, and in blue you see not very recent, but still very meaningful map of the water supply network in Lilongwe. And as you can see, not only part of the city has a water supply network, and at the same time, not in different parts of the city, you have a more dense network than in other parts of the city. So if we think about the politics of distribution and infrastructure, here you have a first dimension where you have a part of the city that actually has infrastructure and centralized water supply services, and then a part of the city that is completely unserved by the public utility and that relies on self-supply. So you have a form of injustice which you can look at in terms of presence or absence of infrastructure. But if we look in more detail to what is happening, we also see that there is a number of inequalities within the water supply network, which is a type of inequality that is less studied within critical water studies, but which has significant consequences in terms of water security. In-house connections allow access to water immediately and whenever that water is needed, while water kiosks are only open a few hours a day, and that already creates a difference in in the type of water security that different neighborhoods can claim in Lilongwe. And then if we look further in detail in terms of how water is flowing and where water is flowing, we can see that there is a significant difference across neighborhoods that are served by the centralized water supply network. So if the water supply network is often depicted as a sort of ensuring inclusive and equitable access to service because everybody pays the same, everybody has the same water quality, everybody can enjoy the same quantity of water, we can see very clearly that this is not what is happening in Lilongwe. I've put here the quotes of the two extremes, the very well-served versus the very poorly served or not unserved neighborhoods, which are supposed to have kiosks, which have a kiosk, but no water runs through the kiosk. But there is also a lot of variation between this and those who have access to water 24/7. As we will see, several neighborhoods have water shortages for a couple of days or only receive water at night. And if you think about this quote of Judith, who says that she lives in a neighborhood that has a kiosk but no water, this is quite at odds with what we see in terms of infrastructural development in the city of Lilongwe. This is a little bit of a historical, very short trajectory of water infrastructure in Lilongwe, which became the capital of Malawi after decolonization. And what you see is that two big dams or large dams were planned in Lilongwe and a number of treatment work and obviously reservoirs and distribution network in the city. These infrastructure were planned with the idea of serving the whole population in Lilongwe. And so also Judith and other people like her who live in informal settlement. But what you see in practice and what we've seen in the previous slide is that these large infrastructures tend to serve in-house connection mostly and partially public water kiosks, while a part of the population is completely disconnected. So if we look at large infrastructure, the politics of large infrastructure from the dam to the user, we can see how a large part of the population is either underserved or unserved, even if the planning of this infrastructure was to serve the whole city, and the reservoir capacity was calculated based on an average of 80 liters per capita per day for all the population in Lilongwe. And so this raises a question about who and why benefits from this large infrastructure, and to whom does the extra water go? And when I talk about extra water, I mean the extra water produced by developing new dams or by developing new treatment facilities. And what you can see in Lilongwe is very clearly from the study by Tivale and his colleagues, is that there are particular areas of the city that are privileged. So here again is a map of Lilongwe. And what you see in green is the city center and the higher income areas, and the north are again some higher income residential areas and the airports and other industrial facilities, while the south east is where the majority of the informal settlement developed over the last 50 years. And what you can see in the dots across the 6 images is where the reservoirs in the city have been developed. And this shows very clearly that the majority of the water infrastructures to transport the water from the dam to different parts of the city have been built in the center and the north of the city, where the higher income population, commercial areas, political and bureaucratic elites reside, and obviously also where the institutional buildings are while much less of this infrastructure has been built in the south, where the demand for water was actually higher. So what you can see with this is that inequalities and water insecurity is actually inscribed in the way the network is designed and in the way the network is developed. And as a result of this, what you see consistently in the city of Lilongwe is that you have areas that are very water secure, and with that I mean that the reservoir capacity is higher than the population, and then you have areas in which the population and so the water demand is much higher the reservoir capacity, which means that also the water availability in this area is much lower than in other areas. And you can see very clearly from these three diagrams that it's the central and the northern zone, the areas that we have seen where the most of the reservoirs were developed, that you actually have a greater water availability, a greater number of reservoirs, which is always matched, if not above, the water demand. As I mentioned in the beginning, of course, from a political ecology perspective, when we look at this uneven development in cities, we are thinking also about unraveling the socio-ecological processes and the choreographies of power that shape this uneven development in the city. And if you think about it also in terms of procedural justice and in terms of power relations, clearly in Lilongwe, the urban planners and the president are the voices that are most important in shaping the form and the infrastructures in the city. And the vision of the president was very clear. Lilongwe is the capital of the new independent state of Malawi, and it is the capital was in Zomba during colonial times, and the president decided to establish a new capital to, as Meyer says, wipe away colonial fingerprints from the newly established independent state. And there was a vision of making the city a modern city that is beautiful to live in, beautiful to work in, beautiful to play in, and a city that is characterized by green spaces, modern water and sanitation infrastructures, as well as important buildings and fountains and other architectural elements to beautify the city. But it was also clear from the beginning that this modern city was not to be for all. Possibly for also financial reason, but possibly also because the citizen that was identified as being relevant and as being deserving of this city is only a certain part of the residents of Lilongwe. So it is the city for the elites, the city for the higher income residents, the city for the higher levels of the bureaucracy, and in general for the urban elites that has to look in modern and that has to have modern infrastructures of water and sanitation. And so you have in Lilongwe this dual city, a modern and rich city with important infrastructures versus what has been called by Englund as a village, which still looks very much like a traditional village with boreholes or water kiosks and less advanced sanitation facilities and also housing structures. And this signals that from the beginning, this idea of the dual city, the city for elites and the city for the common citizen, is central, and also that there is an idea that not all citizens are the same or are valued the same. And this is what is underlying much of the current water insecurity in Lilongwe, particularly if we think that this idea of the premium citizen, the premium customer, and versus the common citizen, which is less important, is also reflected in the way water is distributed in the city of Lilongwe. the infrastructure certainly determines an imbalance between, by providing more water resources, more potable water to the elites as compared to lower income areas. But it is also the way the infrastructure is managed by engineers in the field and how water is distributed by them. And it is very clear in Lilongwe that not all customers are the same. Here, for example, you can see two field engineers opening and closing valves, which determine which part of the city will receive water. And for them, it's very clear that high density areas and poor areas are not so influential, and that the complaints that come from these areas, if they are experiencing water stress also for a long amount of time or even days, it's not as important as if that same complaint would come from a more powerful citizen that is considered more relevant. And we see this reflected also in the way the infrastructure is used in Lilongwe. Here you can see, for example, in the middle of this figure, you can see a diagonal pipe, which is supposed to be used for emergency purposes, to rebalance supply if there is too little water in one zone or in the other zone. So should have this function. But what we have seen in Lilongwe is that this is mainly used to transfer water from the southern zone, which is the poorer part of the city, to the central and northern zones, which are the zones that already have more water availability. And what you see basically, which is really an official practice and recognized, not very hidden practice, because we have heard about it from several interviewees, is that if there is an imbalance of production, they can send water from basically the south to the north. And that obviously will impact the southern zone, which will have even less water and be even more water insecure. And it's very clear that this decision is made in terms of who is critical customer. And it's very clear to the engineers and to the managers of the water utility that these critical customers are not in the southern zone. And so basically, just to summarize, infrastructure, the way the infrastructure is developed and the way the infrastructure is basically used, made to function by engineers in Lilongwe will determine which areas are water secure and which areas are water insecure. And if you look at this figure on the left, you can see neighborhoods that have a per capita consumption of 9, 20, 30 liters per day, and neighborhoods that have a per capita consumption which is above 600 liter per capita per day. So we are talking on the one hand about of water insecure spaces, and on the other hand, more than water secure spaces, spaces where there is a clear overconsumption of water. I want to make an additional point in relation to the city of Lilongwe before we move on to think about more in terms of droughts and water insecurity, which is that we have implications also in terms of gendered water relations. I think it is well known to many of us. I assume that fetching water is usually a task that women have to undertake, and so is selling water at the kiosks. So this is a kiosk in Lilongwe, and you can see that it's a majority of women, or only women actually in this picture, that both sell and buy water. And having water kiosks in the city obviously means that women have to walk, buy water, and return as part of their reproductive activities. But there is more to this issue in Lilongwe. The water kiosks are managed by water users associations. These water users associations are community-based organizations, And in a way, you could consider this a form of participation because they have a partnership with the water utility. But if you look at the way they are structured, you have relevant members of the community, a sort of election for electing the board and the executive, which have these tasks of overseeing the operation and gets good honoraria for doing that. But the real activities of the Water Users Association happen at the lower level, which is the financial manager and the kiosk attendants. In this picture, you can see the kiosk attendant dressed in blue to the right, holding a baby on the back. And what you find is that the kiosk attendants are not present in the higher bodies of the water users associations, and they are not included, therefore, in decisions that are taken by this association. And it shows very clearly that because what they feel are the main concerns in terms of water access and selling water are really not considered as a priority by the Water Users Association. And specifically what happens in Lilongwe is that not only there are water shortages at the kiosk, but there is also the issue that water is mostly available at night, which means that women have to go to buy and sell water at night, which is obviously a risky activity, especially in areas with no electricity, where the nights are really dark. And as you can see here, a few of the women talk about how difficult it is. Selling water at night is difficult. When I'm at the kiosk, I think of my kids that I left home alone. Anything can happen. And so more women talk about the stress of going at night, leaving kids alone, the risks of being attacked, the risks of being robbed. However, these are not issues that are discussed in the water users associations, which are largely led by men and which are disconnected from these problems. So you can see how water insecurity, particularly for women, is exacerbated by the fact that they are excluded from decision-making processes. I'm sorry, I'm checking my time, and I would like now to look at a different example, looking more at what water insecurity might look like when there is a drought, what type of intensification of or not of water insecurity we see, and I will particularly focus on the production of uneven exposure to waterborne diseases. So not looking at water insecurity, not so much as a matter of water quantity, even though that will also be discussed, but also looking at it in terms of water quality in different parts of the city. And just as a way of introducing this, I wanted to show that you have cities, you have again a city that has a very different levels of water and sanitation supplies. The water utility today covers around 65% of the population, while the rest that you can see here in yellow dots is served by small-scale providers. But most importantly, you have a very diverse range of sanitation infrastructure. The sewer network is depicted here in red, only covers 9% of the city, and the rest is basically either septic tanks, improved or unimproved pit latrines, and open defecation. So it is very much at the intersection between this water supply system and sanitation services that we see that during the drought, there is an increased risk of water insecurity and waterborne diseases. So if we look at it historically, we can see that the city has developed these types of infrastructures over an amount of time. The first, differentiation of infrastructure is represented obviously during colonial times, where modern water supply and sanitation systems were reserved to colonial elites, while indigenous populations were excluded. The post-colonial state tried to redress these inequalities, and particularly by expanding the water supply network. Obviously, as you can see here, there is a mix of success in terms of expanding and failures, both in terms of not being able to expand to the entire population, but also in terms of providing very different quality of services in the city center and at the margins of the network. And then with the neoliberalization of particularly water and sanitation services, we see further fragmentation and exacerbation of inequalities. And here one particular element is the privatization of sanitation services. So whilst there is a call to improve sanitation in the city, basically the final responsibility is with the citizens, and therefore depends on their availability, financial availability, and ability to develop sanitation facilities in areas that are not served by the state. And so what we see very clearly is that all these elements, all these infrastructural elements play a significant role in the way the drought unfolds between 2016 and 2018. The water supply network doesn't supply equally different parts of the city, and what we see is that the water restrictions that are put in place to excuse me, there was a noise. The water restrictions that are in place to reduce water consumption really affect much more the margins of the water supply networks where lower income population live. The shortages are longer and more frequent. And this is also due to the fact that lower income residents have very limited storage facilities, while the city center can rely on large storage tanks that basically are used when the water utility rations water. And so actually when we were doing our interviews in Maputo, in higher income areas, many people didn't even really realize that there was a drought or that there was water rationing measures, because there was the buffer of these water infrastructures to protect them from experiencing that water stress that was instead quite common in low-income areas. And the other large difference is that we have seen in Maputo cholera outbreaks that are really concentrated in the areas with on-site sanitation. So while we have no public health crisis in the city center, we have public health crisis and cholera outbreaks in different neighborhoods at the margins of the network. And with this cholera outbreak comes also a stigmatization of those who have the disease, which is defined as the disease of dirty hands. So this obviously has significant policy implications, because basically what happens is that the responsibility for being sick, being ill, is passed on to the consumer. It is not considered an issue of uneven water insecurity in the city, but rather an issue of being dirty, people that are dirty and therefore get sick. And it's very clear from the way water quality is framed by the water utility and other actors in the city. So here you can see, for example, that there is this idea that if water is treated, then the water is safe, and there is no difference between the water that is distributed in low-income and high-income neighborhoods. And very clearly, the water utility, a member of the water utility explains that water is polluted by people using it. It's about the personal maintenance in the house, and what happens is not our responsibility. So we did a study of water quality in Maputo, and we actually found that there is contamination of water also water provided by the water utility, and that this contamination is in the tap. Of course, there is further contamination from storage, but both storage and the taps are basically an outcome of the water supply network in Lilongwe. So whilst the water utility argues that water contamination is produced by the users, we argued that this water contamination was produced really by the way the network is built, and which makes it much more difficult for lower income households to stay sanitary, to stay healthy, and to be clean, due particularly to the water infrastructures and sanitation infrastructures that they use. So what we found is that the drought in combination with flash rains had led to a particular circulation of wastewater flows. So what we see is that the unimproved latrines often exacerbate risks of fecal contamination. Obviously, manual emptying and what is called illegal connection means that there is a flow of wastewater from the latrines to the drainage systems and to the roads and alleys and backyards in the city, making it very difficult to keep the neighborhood clean. And this plays a significant role when the metabolism of the city is accelerated by, on the one hand, urban droughts, and on the other hand, heavy flash rains. In this accelerated metabolism of reduced water availability, increased fecal contamination on streets and on alleys, there is an increased risk of cholera outbreaks. Also because of this practice of cutting pipes and rediverting water flows during the drought, which meant that a lot of pipes were further exposed to water contamination. Now, for the water utility, this is a terrible act, and it's understandable, this is their network. But when we talked to water users, they also said that this was the only way for them to get water and to cope with water insecurity. So here again, you can see how water insecurity is produced, and how also through a politics of water distribution and a politics of the way the networks, not only the water network, but also the sanitation networks are developed or not in certain parts of the city. Now, I wanted to discuss a last example. I'll do it quicker because our time is, I'm checking my time. I'll do it quickly and stop after this last example because I wanted to also talk a little bit about recognitional justice. This is Cape Town. On the top, you see that one of the biggest dams in Cape Town in 2014, and then after in 2018, following 3 years of below average rainfall, 3 years and a half of below average rainfall. There were a number of restrictions in place to mitigate the impacts of reduced water availability. I don't want to go into the detail of this, but just to highlight that these water restrictions have become increasingly more strict and more pressing, and in the end meant that every citizen in Cape Town was only allowed 50 liters per capita per day. I think this drought has been talked about a lot also in international media, and mostly it has been framed as the first time in which a city remains without water, but also very much shocked a lot of audiences because for the first time we have seen white populations queuing to get water from fountains and water sources. So that has created a lot of rumor around this drought, even though and often it has been presented as a drought that affected the middle class. But what we found in reality is that the drought really, not surprisingly, affected the most those who already were more water insecure. And this has to do with the adaptive capacity of different social groups. So, for example, the higher income residents who before the drought consumed huge amounts of water, 10,000 liters per capita per day. Surely, in terms of absolute water use, they had to reduce the most their consumption, but they were able to compensate, first of all, by buying bottled water, but also by building rainwater harvesting facilities and by building boreholes in their homes. So paradoxically, they have come out of the drought more water secure than when they entered the drought, while middle-class people were able to compensate by buying, for example, bulk water and stocking a lot of water, which made the drought more bearable, while it is particularly the low-income groups that were shock and that suffered and experienced the most significant impacts of the drought. But rather than talking about these more vulnerable groups, I would like to close by looking at the study done by Elisa Savelli, which I think is really interesting because it focuses on the urban elites in Cape Town and their perception of the drought and their emotions when it comes to how they experienced the drought. I think that this is quite interesting because political ecology scholarship tends to focus largely on more marginalized groups, so focuses mostly on, in our case, on water insecure groups. But Elisa has instead interviewed a number of the urban elites of Cape Town, people who live in houses like this, just to give you a sense where you can see there is a huge display of wealth, but also huge display of water. And what we see here is that if we think about it in terms of recognitional justice or recognitional injustice, the way they tell the story of the drought, the way they interpret the drought is really basically a radical erasure of the historical and persisting inequalities and marginalization of racial groups, as well as socioeconomic minority groups. As you can read here, they feel that the drought has been actually caused by the groups that consume less water, because their idea is that they are not going to turn the taps off even on day zero, and that's why the elite, have to get tense, and they think that actually this is very unfair. And here again, another quote from another household that argues that the problem is amongst the Black people who don't care because they don't have to pay for water. Black people have a culture of refusing to pay, and the government cannot let them pay. So just to show a very surprising finding from a study where you can see that those who consume by far the most, that are in a position of privilege, how the way they understand the drought is that this is a responsibility of those who are most water insecure. And I think this is a very important finding for two reasons. One is because we are talking about the groups that are over-consuming in the city and that should be targeted for water demand management in the city. And two, because we are talking about groups that are politically very powerful and in a position to influence water distribution process, urban development processes in the city of Cape Town. And it matters what they think, and it matters. It is important for us as political ecologists and critical scholars to get a better understanding of how elites think and how they influence urban development processes and water developments in the city. And I think that centering on these groups is really important when we talk about demand management. And here again, average understandings of water demand are not useful. There is a need to think about increasing the demand of those who are water insecure and significantly reducing the demands of those who overconsume. And therefore, I think this is a very illuminating study to move also our research or research in critical water study in that direction. And I'll stop here because I think I have reached my time. I haven't been able to talk about aspirational justice, but that will be for another time then.
That sounds good. I thank you so much, Maria, and I love that we can already create upcoming future webinars. I think this is incredible, and there's definitely much more to be discussing indeed. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your research and discussing how these outcomes of water crisis are distributed and how they are created. And there's some questions in the chat for you already. I see, I think you opened the Teams window on your screen. So now we see
double.
Yeah,
sorry.
So perhaps you can collapse that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, can I keep you though, so at least I can see you.
I think you can, if you stop sharing the screen, you can come back to the main room. I think maybe that's a way of making it a little bit more social.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yes, thank you so much. So the very first question goes back to the definitions, and it's precisely about how we can define urban drought. So are there many ways of defining it? Would it be an imbalance between water demand and water capacity? Would it be a drought even resulting in water scarcity? Or are there other way of defining it? And what kind of definition do you operate with?
Okay, that's a difficult question, but I think if when I think about urban droughts, I think about well, I should start by saying that I work a lot with climatologists and hydrologists. And when I think about urban droughts, I connect more with definitions that come from those disciplines, and I'm thinking about really the above average precipitation over an extended period of time, over an extended years. And so I really look at the physical processes, and then if hydrologists were here, they will talk about how droughts propagate from meteorological to agricultural droughts and so on. But I won't do it. I'm sure there's people in the audience who would do it much better. But so I really look at it as a physical processes, and when I think about then water insecurity or climate drought-related water crisis, that's when I think more around the social production of insecurity, and think more about how this physical process intersects with social worlds and political processes.
Thank you so much, Maria. There's a lot of great questions in the chat, so I'm trying to perhaps merge them together so you can address as many as possible. A general question would be whether you see this differentiation between a shortage versus scarcity, this biophysical and socially constructed perception in policymaking, and whether the technocratic definition is still dominating, and if so, why is it dominating? And yeah, let's start with that.
Yeah, I think these definitions are still dominating. I mean, if we think about circles of, critical water scholars and academic circles, some scholars, I think, in the field of political ecology and so on, I think we are looking, these ideas of, as I said, production of water scarcity, path-breaking work of 20 years ago, Laila Mehta and other colleagues, Danish Mustafa and other ways have already, told us to, have already invited us to think about the social production. And so in our circles is established. Of course, we are looking at different we are looking at different contexts, and there is maybe a need to think about how these concepts play out in with intensifying climate change, and so also in context of changing physical processes. Outside, I think they are more established because they are, I think, easier to deal with. They take away a layer of complexity, and taking away politics makes it easier to manage problem without. But from our perspective, I think one could argue that if you conceal these power relations, you will probably develop policies that tend to reproduce these injustices rather than challenge or redress these injustices. But I think they take away a level of complexity that makes addressing issues much more structural, much more complex.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer, and I think it also leaves some food for thought. To stay within this policy-making context, there's some questions on how the political ecology framework or insights in general can help us guide the creation of better, more future-oriented projects. So, for example, if there's an already made decision about, let's say, a desalination plant in a water-scarce area, how can we navigate it to come up with a more just outcomes? And how can national governments perhaps create more just outcomes in also decentralized systems?
Political ecology, that's a nice question, because I think possibly it has an implicit critique. I mean, I think what political ecology does very well, and that's my opinion, obviously, is it does very well trace the socio-ecological processes that generate uneven outcomes at multiple scales. So it's very strong in the critical elements. Some people say that the critique is the DNA of political ecology. But some scholars have suggested that this critique is perhaps not alone. It's not sufficient to take us, to, on the one hand, to imagine different futures, and but also think more in terms of even just future-oriented perspectives. And I think I have been working, which is what I was going to present in the end, but I have gone over time. I apologize. Recently, I've been thinking exactly about this question, and what could a political ecology perspective add to the way futures are framed in methods, particularly of the physical sciences, so scenarios and models. And I think there is a lot of room to work more experimentally with political ecology, to think exactly about this. When we have certain developments, what will, based on this critical analysis, how can they help us understand implications for the future, implications for future justice? And I think that requires a different political ecology from the one that we have seen until now. I personally have worked on repoliticizing models and scenarios through a political ecology lens, trying to think really what's taking certain premises from political ecology on critiques of the economic system, and taking uneven development as a starting point. So changing the assumptions that are typically used in models, what type of analysis we can do about the future. And I think I'm at the beginning of this work, but my avenue is to work around these ideas of repoliticizing these approaches, working across disciplines with colleagues that are willing and well-versed in doing that. So we need a bit of a new political ecology for that, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There's so many questions. I do apologize. We're going to do only one more as we're running out of time. There's a question about so urban pro-poor facilities that can help in lower income areas. And the question is about those tensions. So whether there is a sense of tension between the national utility supplier, who could see those kind of facilities as a threat as they don't bring in as much revenue. So do you experience, or have you seen that that there are instances where potential good initiatives maybe bring in a lot of certain neglected issues or costs that we don't really see?
I think so, and I think that's also because the water utilities, just to take a sort of defense of the water utility, or some water utilities, they are asked to undertake an impossible task, because they are asked to, ensure universal access to basic services, but also they're not really subsidized, at least in the places where I've done my work. At the same time, they are asked to ensure financial sustainability without external subsidies, and those two things are quite difficult to achieve. One utility manager in Lilongwe told me once, it's like playing tennis with both of my hands tied in my back, And surely there is this tension there. I think that the water utilities tend to then prioritize the financial goals, probably for pressures, and that also prevents from implementing projects in a way that is really meaningful and effective for communities in low-income areas.
Thank you so much. Dr. Maria Rusca, this has been such an inspiring talk, and even in the comments you can see there's so many people who want more, so perhaps we can find some ways of continuing this conversation. For now, I would really like to thank you for your time and for sharing your experience with us. Also, thank you to the audience for being with us.